So the Book of Concord is the confessions of our Lutheran Church. It contains our teachings, but it's not something that most people are going to read. But it does include what we believe. So I have the three-legged stool for you, and it includes up and down religion, law and gospel, and the theology of the cross. Have you heard of any of those things before?
I think theology of the cross I've heard of, but not the other two.
No? Yeah, so the three-legged stool basically are the three most basic and important tenets of Lutheranism. And a lot of times if, we try to teach these things to kids who are in 8th grade, and is it super effective? Probably not, because they most likely don't want to be there. Or like when I was in confirmation, we were trying to get pencils to stick in the ceiling and throwing stuff out the windows just to aggravate our teacher a bit. So did we learn as much as we could have? Probably not. So the reason for this short course is to think about these things and to think about what we believe in a more intentional way. So the three-legged stool, up and down religion. It's just what it sounds like. Up religion is the idea that you have to do good works and follow God's commands and laws, and then you'll travel up the ladder to heaven. When you do something bad, you slide down the ladder. I often talk about chutes and ladders. I've brought my chutes and ladders game to church before to talk about climbing the ladders and then sliding down the slides. We are not a up religion. Lutheranism is a down religion. We believe that God always comes down to us with grace and love. We don't have to go up to God. God will always continuously keep coming down to us. So we don't have to fall into this cycle of despair where you're in your mind, you're climbing the ladders, you're doing good things, you're working the lines for the food pantry, so you climb up the ladder, and then when you get into your car, you say a couple swear words about how cold it was, and then you slide back down the ladder. We don't have to fall into that cycle because it's not what we believe, and it's not who we believe God is. So then the next part of the three-legged stool is law and gospel. A lot of people get confused and think that law is just the Old Testament, gospel is just the New Testament. We think that because God outlines the law in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament we have the Gospels, right? But that's not the case. In all of Scripture, we find law and we find gospel. The law gives us knowledge of our sin and makes our consciences a little terrified, makes us worried about who we are as people, and then the gospel gives us comfort. And the third leg of our three-legged stool is the theology of the cross. So the theology of the cross, in basic terms, is that God shows up in the last place we would reasonably look, and that's on a cross. To the world, it doesn't make sense to die on a cross. Why would a God come down to earth and then die on a cross? That doesn't show strength. To the world, it shows weakness. So those are the three basic things that if somebody said, what do Lutherans believe? Those are the things that you might want to point to. So my professor used to say that if you took the Bible and you put it in a pot, he would talk about in the South how they would cook beans. They would cook them for like 24 hours. And he had never seen anything like that. He was from Wisconsin. But he uses that as an example to say if you put the Bible in a pot and you cooked it for 24 hours, when you lift the lid, Luther's Small Catechism would pop out. So the Small Catechism is often thought of as something that we teach, like I mentioned, hormonally challenged 8th graders. But the Small Catechism was actually written to be an at-home resource where the leader of the house, oftentimes the father in this case, would be able to teach the rest of the household what they believed. Because there were a lot of people walking around that they said, well, we're Christians, but they had no idea really what that meant. They didn't have access to the scriptures. They couldn't read the Bible on their own because most people couldn't read. And it was also written at that time, during Luther's time, in Latin. If you could get a Hebrew or Greek copy, that's probably also a language that you don't read. But Luther eventually translates the Bible into German. That really catapults the Bible being translated into tons of different languages. And now, obviously, it's translated into every language that you could possibly think of. So, the Catechism was meant to be read by the head of the household. Say you're sitting around the dinner table and you can teach your family, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house." And if you don't know how to explain that to your family, it gives you the answer. And you just read that to your family over and over again. So the word catechism is actually a Greek word. It's made up of two separate words, kata and echo, which means to repeat again. It's sort of the fashion of the old one-room schoolhouses where the teacher would say something and the students would repeat it back. Learning through repetition, right? They would say 2 + 2 is 4. The students would say 2 + 2 is 4 over and over again, and eventually they would understand that 2 + 2 is 4. So in the 2nd century, catechism was already being used as a verb for basic Christian instruction by the early Christians. Augustine turned catechism into a noun that we now use today. When you say, "Oh, I have to go to catechism class," or cat class, as people often call it. In those days and following, the catechism wasn't a book like this. It was simply a practice of instructing on the Christian faith. So, like I said, Luther's catechism is addressed to parents. Once Luther started producing single pages, so it was a big, long page that Luther printed up of one tenet of the faith, and they were actually selling the papers on the street corners for people. So they could take this one sheet of paper home, they could hang it on the wall. Oftentimes it featured woodcuts, which I have some woodcuts there to show you from some of Luther's early catechisms that were put together. And printing was actually becoming more and more popular after we have the printing press and things like that. So some entrepreneurial printers thought, "Oh, I could collect all these pages and put them together," and eventually it becomes a book like this. So the order of the small catechism is the 10 Commandments, the Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. Those are the 3 basic things. Now later we add baptism and Eucharist to the catechism because those are our 2 sacraments. But this 10 Commandments, Creed, Lord's Prayer winds up being diagnosis, prescription, and a way to get that prescription filled. So if you get sick, you go to the doctor and they diagnose you with something, right? I was struggling with a sinus infection for a few weeks. Went to the doctor. They said, "Oh, you have a raging sinus infection." I said, "I know." They prescribed the pills. Now that's not enough, right? Because they're not going to hand me the pills. I have to go either by myself or I have to send someone out to get my pills for me. And then obviously you have to take the pills and then you get better. But that's the model that we're going to use as we go through the catechism and learn about what Luther teaches us. So, do you guys have any question about the background information? I basically wanted to just make something short that you could understand how we came to this, and then we can get into the 10 Commandments. Do you guys remember, like, your catechism classes, what they were like?
I was in 3rd grade. I was raised Catholic.
Yeah.
So by 3rd grade, 8 years old or so, we had to do the catechism.
Yeah. And theirs was different, obviously.
Yeah.
I was probably like more of the 8th grade
Yeah.
kind of thing. I went to Rosedale. UCC
Okay.
was my church growing up. So it's been a long time.
So they also taught you something different there.
No specific memories, but just, more of the just falling through the Bible.
Yeah.
It wasn't, a separate kind of study book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Liz went to Sunday school at Rosedale over the years, but then she never went to like a cat class.
Yeah. I mean, it's really that catechism class is really something that we've kind of put more emphasis and theology on than actually exists. It's just a way of saying, okay, you're about the age that you can sort of take your faith into your own hands, so we're going to teach it to you. There's no, like, some people will say, oh, I was never confirmed, and it's like, can I get confirmed now? And it doesn't matter. It really is not like a thing that has any bearing on anything. The important things that, you know, we do are baptism and Eucharist. So it's not like you have to, the Catholics have catechism as a sacrament that you go through, and it's very formal. For us, it's not really.
Yeah, I used to think, and maybe I'm remembering wrong, but at Rosedale, almost like it was, I don't think you took communion until you got confirmed. So that's never been that way in the Lutheran.
Yeah, well, Lutherans believe that, I mean, they've come to have, like, First Communion in, like, 1st or 3rd grade, depending on what church you go to. Some do 5th grade. It's really, you know, but actually in the Orthodox Church, and some Lutherans do this as well, that as soon as you're baptized, they say you can have communion. So they'll even commune infants.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not like you really need to have some kind of formal thing, because the reality, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about the sacrament of the altar, but really, who understands it? You know, people will say, oh, well, kids can't have communion because they don't understand. But do any of us really understand how it works, you know? You know, we, as Lutherans, we say that we believe in the real presence. We believe that Christ truly shows up. Well, how? Who knows, you know? And we're not as stringent about it as, like, the Episcopalians, where I've seen, actually, one of my professors was Episcopalian, and somebody dropped some bread on the front floor, and she dove for it, worried that Jesus was going to hit the ground. Where, like, for us, it's, if I drop a wafer, I'll pick it up and eat it myself so that I don't have to hand it to someone else. But, like, I'm not worried that Jesus hurt his head as he fell to the floor. Yeah. When you guys joined the Lutheran Church, did you have any kind of, like, Lutheran instruction or something like that?
Not really.
No.
Yeah, it's
just,
not
like,
really.
Sat with Pastor Denise, but it was very brief. But and that surprised me a little. I thought there was going to be some kind of expectation that I'd have to be more educated.
Yeah.
Doing. But I had religious background, but just not.
Well,
not
you know,
Lutheran.
most people's education ends with Sunday school, so it's really like
But, yeah. All good.
it's kind of wild. Because I think other churches that have higher expectations of their people, like evangelical churches and things like that, have expectations that people will go to a small group and learn stuff and kind of practice their faith, go to Bible study, whatever, and we are kind of just like, oh, well, we just hope you show up, and if you show up, that's great. If you don't show up, we'll probably still be fine if you show up every now and then, or, you know, whatever. So, Luther includes the 10 Commandments. I think a lot of the times we think, well, the 10 Commandments are pretty important, right? Moses brings them down from the mountain. God says, these are the things that you have to do. So, a lot of them are pretty easy to follow, right? Once we get to, like, the 3rd commandment, remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. Okay, so we'll go to church and we'll do church things on Sundays. And the 4th commandment, honor your father and mother. Well, that's easier as you get older, unless you have a estranged relationship with them. But when you're a kid, it's, you know, when you're in 8th grade and you hear honor your father and mother, you're like, oh, brother, I'm not really interested in that. But the 5th commandment, that's pretty easy. Thou shalt not kill. I've never accidentally killed someone. My conscience isn't terrified about that. Don't commit adultery. That one, you know, pretty easy for me. Some people struggle with that. But don't steal. Don't bear false witness against your neighbor, which means, like, don't gossip about them. That one I think is pretty hard. We were just breaking the 8th commandment when we were in here, thinking about different cars that were in line at the food bank. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. That one tends to be a little hard, right? You see somebody has a really beautiful house or a beautiful car or nice landscaping, something like that. You might wish you had that. Don't covet their ox or ass. Not really concerned about that. None of my neighbors have any animals. So, most of the commandments, I would say, are not that hard. to follow. Here comes John. I told him that he had to come over here after he was done putting salt on the parking lot at Calvary. John Seifert. He went to the front door, so he'll find his way over here. So in the 10 Commandments, Luther is really asking the question, how are you doing with that? The first commandment, have no other gods. How are you doing with that? Do you feel like you do a good job following the 10 Commandments?
Yeah.
You do?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like they're not that hard, but I probably, if we were to do a real honest assessment, I'm probably not that good at it. Because it doesn't, like the first commandment, for instance, it doesn't mean don't have another god. Like, don't start worshiping Zeus or, it means that, but, like, obviously we're not going to do that. But it means, like, don't make the lottery into your god. Don't make, a certain a certain game, or don't make your phone into your god. Yeah, don't make TikTok into your god. Anything like that, we don't want to think about above God. So maybe they're harder than we first thought. So the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods. We find that in Exodus. We find it in Deuteronomy. It's all over the Bible. And it also is in all of the other commandments, right? Basically, because it says we should fear, love, and trust God above all things. And then if you look at the second commandment, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord in vain. Answer, we should fear and love God. And then it goes on to that commandment. Third commandment, answer, we should fear and love God. And it continues to repeat that one because basically all of the commandments rely on the first commandment. It's always in the form of a question. What is this? Have you heard of that? Was ist das? It's basically, if we had a German copy of this, here it's translated, what is meant by this commandment? In German, it just says, was ist das? Now John's lost. Let me get him in here. This is him walking around. John, I see you roving around the parking lot. You actually got here at a better time because the food pantry lines are down. Sit. Welcome to our class.
Hello.
We were talking about how sinful you are.
Oh, that's good.
Let me get you the papers.
Got to take notes.
No, they're already taken. Made it real easy on you. So, like I was saying, this author translated it, what is meant by this commandment? German, it's just was ist das. A lot of times, people will say, what does this mean? But really, the German is, what is this? So,
What is it?
what is it? Yeah.
What is it?
So the question, and then what is it? What does this mean? What are we trying to say here? Again, meant so that the father of the household or the mother of the household or an older child could read the commandment, and then instead of having to come up with their own answer, they say this is exactly what it means. We should fear, love, and trust God above all things. So Luther got married in 1525 to Katie. And Hans, their firstborn, came along in 1526. They didn't waste any time. And so Luther wrote the Small Catechism in 1529, a few years later. So if we do a little math, Hans was about 2 or 3 years old, running around the Augustinian monastery where they were living, pointing at things like kids do and say, Daddy, was ist das? Was ist das? Was ist das? over and over again, which kids do. Kids get in the stage where they say, what is this? What is that? What is this? What does this do? So we can imagine him then writing this catechism in that light, thinking, I'm the father. How will I teach this to my kid? How does this relate to younger members of the household? This simple question invites us to paraphrase. So when the pupil asks the question, was ist das? The pastor or teacher or leader of the home is called to confess their faith. So if someone were to say to you, you should fear and love God, or how is it written in here? I'm the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And if I said to you, what does that mean? What would you say?
We should fear, love, and trust in God above all things.
You use their example. But if you didn't have that in front of you and you didn't know that, what would you say? If I said, I'm the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods before me. You know? You should only have one God?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Anybody else have any ideas?
That's pretty much what I would say.
Yeah. So it calls you then to investigate your own faith and say from your heart what it is. If someone just walking down the street said, what do you believe in? You know, I heard about these 10 commandments. What are they? Then your answer you would be forced to look inside of your own heart and answer from that space. So that's kind of the whole point of the style in which this is written. And Luther doesn't say, I should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. He says, we should do that. It goes from this I, which I think generally we are, and they were as well, we are way more an individual culture where we think, I have to get myself right with God. I have to do these things, when in actuality, it's about all of us. It's about all of our faith. It's about how we all together confess our faith. So the law, the commandments, for instance, show us where we fall short. They show us our sickness. So if we're reading through the commandments, like I said, sure, we don't have other gods. We're not worshiping Zeus or any of the other gods that we've heard about throughout history. But maybe there are things in our lives. A lot of people, it's work. Work becomes their god. They spend so much time working. They don't have time with family. They don't have time for leisure. They don't have time for rest. They're just working and working and working. And work becomes their god. So if you're a person like that, this commandment might terrify your conscience. It might point you to your sickness. And when you're pointed to your sickness, when you get your diagnosis, then you have to be pointed to how you're going to help that diagnosis. So we're supposed to do these things, but we don't. Like I said, it's not hard to not kill people, but Luther isn't just talking about this is the command and that's what you follow. It's also whatever the opposite of the command is. So if the command is don't kill, okay, fine, I won't kill anyone. But am I doing things that bring life? Am I doing things that promote life? Am I doing things that build up life? That becomes harder, right? Or the 8th commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor, which basically means you shouldn't gossip about them and tell lies about them. Great. But am I saying good things about my neighbor? Am I building my neighbor up? And it's not just your neighbor next door. I've had this continuing feud with my neighbor across the street where they have a driveway and I don't have a driveway. So I park my car in front of their house. Now their driveway holds 4 or 5 cars. They have 2 cars. So if I were them, I would never park my car on the street because you have a driveway. I park my car in front of their house because it's easier than parking further down the street, especially when I'm like carrying Nora or whatever, if the spot in front of my house is full. They parked one of their cars there that wasn't running for like 6 weeks. And I feel like it was because I keep parking in front of their house. Now, I say a lot of things about my neighbor to my wife because they drive me nuts. And when I first moved in, they were very nice to us, and they said, we party all the time in our yard. We like to sit at our table and listen to music and have drinks. If it's ever too loud, let us know. It's never been too loud. I mean, I can hear it if I'm outside, but I don't hear it in my house. So I'm not sure where the relationship broke down, but it's not just about our neighbors that live near us, thank God. But either way, right, don't say false things about your neighbor. So also, build your neighbor up. How are you going to do that? How are you going to be concerned about your neighbor's welfare? How are you going to be concerned about how your neighbor's doing? So, the 10 Commandments are a list of things that we should do, but we don't. In Scripture, ought never implies a can. Scripture tells us all kinds of things that we ought to do, but maybe we can't do them, right? We're sick with sin. It's hard to do the things that align with God when you're sick with sin. And not only that, our world is sick with sin. So even if you were able to say, you know what? No sins today. Today I'm not doing any sins. Now maybe you'd have to sit alone in your house. I don't know. But if you just are very intentional about it, and maybe you can get through a whole day without you yourself doing any sins, you would still be sinning. Because the clothes that you wear, maybe they were made in a sweatshop, right? The companies that we support. I think about this all the time with my retirement savings because I changed everything to like ethical investments, which gets you a lot less money, unfortunately. So like my retirement account doesn't invest in things like bombs and missiles and guns and whatever, which that's where the money's at, unfortunately. But those are sins that we do on a daily basis that we don't even know we do. We can't know, we can't know if our fruits and vegetables were ethically sourced. We can't know if the person picking the bananas was beaten every day and paid a penny. So it's impossible. What I'm trying to say is it's impossible not to sin. So in Scripture, when it says you ought to do these things, sometimes you just can't. There are things we ought to do, but there are also all things we don't do. So every time Luther sees a commandment, like I said, he thinks about both what it commands, but also what it calls us to do. So what we shouldn't do and what we should do. So I invite you to look at the commandments instead of a list of what not to do, but instead a list of what to do. So let's look at one we didn't use as an example yet. Thou shalt not steal. Was ist das? We should so fear and love God as not to rob our neighbor of his money or property, which isn't really that hard not to do, nor bring it into our possession by unfair dealing or fraudulent means, but rather assist him to improve and protect it. So what part of that is what not to do, and what part of that is what to do? Yeah.
I think protect is part of what to do.
What was the first part?
Protect.
Protect what to do.
Yeah, the protect is what to do, right? Assist him to improve and protect it. And obviously the not to do is steal. So Luther really takes all the guessing out of this with making sure he outlines everything. And it's in such simple terms. Again, because it's meant to be understood by people of all ages. The commandments wind up being a mirror that reflects back to us what we don't do. A diagnosis, because we don't fear and trust God, therefore all of our relationships are broken. our relationships with God, our relationships with our neighbor, that is to say, all of our fellow humanity, and our relationship with creation. So the nice thing about this little book is you can stick it next to your toilet or wherever you read, and you can get through it very quickly. But it'll tell you, like I said, John wasn't here yet, if you took the Bible and you put it in a pot and you boiled it for 24 hours and then you opened the lid, this would pop out. So you're going to get all the themes of what we as Christians believe and how we ought to live out our lives from this simple book, which actually breaks it down quite nicely. You guys have any questions about what we've talked about so far?
I just had a comment.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of emphasis on fear here, which I wasn't expecting. Like you know, like you said, every time it says I should fear God. And I just wasn't expecting that, especially when you kind of started off where how Lutheran is all about that I'm more or less going to be forgiven. It's not like I'm doing all my good things to get to heaven. So I was just a reaction that it seemed to be like, I'm kind of scared. You know?
When the
What's the fear?
so now, right, the pupil asks the teacher.
I just wanted to keep the kids in line. So as a parent, I could see me saying to her, "You fear."
As the pupil asks the teacher, now I'm called to confess my own faith. So the fear is not you should be afraid. That's just kind of the translation that's used. It's not you should be afraid of God because God's going to put you in hell, or you should be afraid of God or else. It's that you should recognize, that you should be aware of, that you should be intentional about your relationship with God. Now, again, we can allow this and Scripture itself to interpret itself by saying, what type of religion are we? Are we an up religion or are we a down religion?
I only know this because you had said it earlier. We're a down religion.
We're a down religion. So when you think about it, there are a lot of Christian denominations and practices that say, well, you need to do X amount of things. If you don't tithe a certain amount, if you don't go to a certain amount of small groups, if you don't go to Bible study a certain amount of times, if you don't show up in worship enough, you're somehow not in favor with God. But that's just not the case. So let me try to show you a little something about medieval theology. So when Luther was coming up with all this stuff, when he was writing, when he was studying, we had this medieval understanding that in life there was a state of sin and a state of grace. So, none of these markers are all that great. So, if Liz decided that she wasn't going to obey her mom, she's in a state of sin.
Yeah.
Now, in order for Liz to stop being in a state of sin, Liz needs to do something good, right?
Yeah.
So Liz shovels the pavement because her mom can't. So now Liz moves over here
Only that can happen.
from a state of sin to a state of grace. Now Liz is happy, but Liz said a bad word. Back over here. And it becomes this endless cycle. So, the Catholic Church got smart. They thought, well, this is the theology that we have going on. And at the time, it's the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church. So they said, well, this is the theology. So now we know that people struggle to get from here to here. We know that they're going to be in this constant cycle. So what we're going to tell them, and this is going to really benefit us because we want to build nice churches, we're going to tell them that all they got to do is pay us some money and we'll give them an indulgence, which we totally made up. And then they can, instead of doing a nice thing, they can just move over here by paying us enough money, even after death. So if they say, oh, my relative, he was a real jerk, he's probably over here, which puts him down here in hell, right? And this is heaven. Should really be up here, I guess. But either way, when you're on this side, you get to go to heaven. When you're on this side, you get to go to hell. So if you pay us the money, though, you don't even need to worry about doing the nice stuff. The more money you have, the better. You pay us, you come over here. Not only that, we build nice churches. Everybody wins. When Luther started to recognize that this was what was going on, he was livid. He already didn't agree with a lot of the things that the church was teaching, but when he heard about this, when Johann Tetzel came into Wittenberg, where he was living, and said, come buy your indulgences, he was really mad. And that drives him, obviously, to write the 95 Theses. But this is the prominent theology of the day. So everything that Luther is writing is in, nicely erasing there, is in that mindset, that understanding. So he himself was very fearful of God. He had a very, very terrified conscience. Luther was said to have gone to confession multiple times a day, where he would go to confess his sins, and eventually it's said that the priest said to him, Luther, don't come back until you have a real good one. Because he would go and he would confess little tiny things that he would do wrong throughout the day, and he was driving them nuts. But it was all because he was so worried that he needed to get from this state of sin to state of grace. When he starts to realize that that's not the reality, he says, you know what? This isn't God. God is loving. God is graceful. And this money that comes in here is that the priest and the other people who were under holy orders said, well, we don't really do bad stuff. So we have all this grace built up. So that's what we're going to sell to the other people. Which is smart on their part, but also very evil. So definitely no fear. Once you are, Luther talks about Christian freedom. And basically our Christian freedom is that you are free. You are going to heaven. That's the bottom line. Now that you know that, you don't have to waste all this time thinking about, oh, what if I go to hell? You don't have to waste all this time coming up with schemes in order to move yourself from a state of sin to a state of grace. So with all that extra time, your freedom is that you get to, on behalf of God, love and serve your neighbor. My professor would tell a story about a teacher that he had in class who his first profession was teaching, and then he went to seminary and he was going to become a pastor, and my professor gave a lecture about, this kind of thing about Christian freedom and about, what are you going to do now that you know that you have all this time that you don't need to worry about your salvation? Because a lot of people who go to seminary are thinking, well, this is going to make me better. This is going to make me holier. And it's anything but that. It actually made me less holy, the shenanigans that happen at the seminary. But aside from that, this teacher was sitting through this lecture, and when the professor got to the end, and his big moment was, what are you going to do now that you know you don't have to do anything? Now that you know you don't have to do anything for your salvation, what are you going to do? And this guy raised his hand and said, I think I'm going to go back to teaching. And he was serious. He went back to being a teacher. Because being a pastor wasn't going to lead him to have some kind of holy relationship with God. It wasn't going to bring him closer to God. There's nothing that we can do to draw ourselves closer to God. God does all the drawing. And that's, again, the up religion versus down religion. Up religion says you have to do things. You have to read the Bible from cover to cover every year. You have to do whatever it is that they decide you have to do in order to have favor with God, in order to go to heaven. But when you realize that Christ already paid the price for that, right? Not in the sense that Christ was paying God with blood or anything like that, but Christ did all the work for us. Now that you know that, what are you going to do? And Luther would say, well, now the Holy Spirit propels you out into the world, propels you to love your neighbor, propels you to serve your neighbor, propels you to think of ways that you can put the most charitable construction on all of your neighbor's actions, or worship, pray, praise, offer thanksgiving, honor, serve, obey, love, and esteem your mother and father. Comfort him in danger and want any of your neighbor who you think about killing. Honor your wife or husband. John.
Oh, I have to.
It says it right. It says it right here.
Oh. Where's that? I'm going to have to wipe that one.
Cheryl says, why is there white out all over this page? I don't know. Do you guys have any other questions? I did want to mention the woodcuts. These are, I mean, they're incredible. The first one you see is baptism. So you see like a small child getting baptized over a font with people around. The second one is the 10 Commandments. So that's God handing the 10 Commandments to Moses. And then hallowed be thy name is one of the petitions of the Lord's Prayer. And these were included in, so it also helped people who might not have been able to understand as much with just hearing the words, especially maybe even younger children, but now they can also see a picture that goes along with it. And some of these woodcuts are still floating around. People have them in their own personal collections and things where the wood obviously was chiseled out and the ink was put on it and it was printed then once they started printing the books, but also when they were printing the big papers, there were woodcuts on those as well. So it wasn't just to appeal to, you to read it, but it also appealed to more of your senses by you being able to visualize what was going on.
So he was a member of the Catholic Church and then split off.
Yeah.
I saw a special on this a while back, and I mean, it was very, very, I guess I'm more of a visual learner than reading and stuff.
Yeah.
And it was one of those, like, history channels, but I'll tell you what, it mesmerized me, and that was one thing I remember, that he broke away from that and did his own thing.
Yeah, so pretty much the only option was, in Germany, was the Roman Catholic Church. Because Constantine, when he became the emperor of the Roman Empire, made Christianity the religion of the empire, the Roman Catholic Church was everywhere. Now, of course, when Henry VIII wanted to get divorced, he created the Church of England so that he could get divorced, because you couldn't get divorced if you were Catholic. And then we get all these other denominations later. What happened was, the story goes, that Luther was out in a lightning storm. And he thought he was going to die. It was thundering and lightning. And he said, God, if you spare me, I'll become a monk. He lived through that experience. He became a monk. So he took holy vows, which is a sacrament in the Catholic Church that not everybody has access to because you have to be called, to do those things. But he became a monk. And that is when he really got his terrified conscience, when he really started to go to confession all the time. And Luther became a professor. And when Luther started to recognize all these things, he had the heart of a pastor. And he thought, this is terrible, telling people, because he knew it wasn't true, telling people that they had to pay to earn their salvation, or they had to pay to sort of soothe their souls. So with the heart of a pastor, he said there's no way. And he got himself into a lot of trouble. They asked him to recant what he had said multiple times. He said no. They excommunicated him. So he definitely got in a lot of trouble with the Pope and other leaders of the church and also civil government. But he didn't care because he felt like his message of grace being free, a free gift, was more important than worrying about what they were going to do to him. There was a movie, I'd say maybe even 20 years ago now, that maybe more, that came out called Luther, and it follows history quite well. It follows the history of the Reformation pretty well and talks about, the different meetings that they had and things where Luther said, here I stand. I'm not going to recant what I said. You guys know I'm right. But the reality for the Catholic Church was that they didn't want to lose the power that they had over the people. They didn't want to put the power in the people's hands. They didn't want the people reading scripture, and Luther translated the Bible into German, giving anybody who could read access to the Bible in Germany. They didn't want that. They wanted it to only be the priest who could read Latin, and then the priest would then tell the people what they believed. So like I had said, there were tons of people walking around who had no idea really what it meant to be a Christian, what they really believed. They went to Mass, and the Mass was in Latin, and they probably didn't understand it. So really, this is a turning point for people being more involved in the church and taking some of the power away from the church, but it's still, the Catholic Church didn't crumble because of this. They surely had some reforms, and they've had Vatican I and Vatican II, and they've made some changes to how they teach and what they believe, but a lot of the crux of it is still there. And Luther never intended to start a different denomination. He didn't want there to be division in the church. He just wanted them to reform the Catholic Church and to fix the things that were wrong.
The Catholic Church still goes down the same road it has been.
Well, in a lot of ways, it's definitely still very priest-focused. They have a lot of control over things like who is allowed to have communion, which, like, if you come to either of our churches on a Sunday morning, whether I know if you're baptized or not, I'm going to offer you communion. It's not, but if I go to a Catholic church, I'm probably not going to be able to commune there. My nephew tells a funny story because he goes to Catholic school now. He was going to Central Middle School in Reading, and it just didn't fit with him because he's a more anxious kid. He had been homeschooled, so it just wasn't a good fit. So he goes to Sacred Heart now, and he talks about how he went up for communion the first time that they had Mass because nobody knew that he wasn't Catholic, and then they found out, and now they told him, like, you're not allowed to have communion at church. Like, they'll allow him to bring the elements forward, they'll allow him to, hand out bulletins or anything like that, but he's not allowed to commune, even though, he goes to school there because he's not Catholic, he's Lutheran, and they know that. But some priests are more lenient than others.
Yeah.
Some priests kind of go against what the Catholic Church says, and they have more open communion policies. But if Rome finds out, you're in trouble because you still are connected to the Vatican in that way. So for next time, we're going to talk about the Creed. And it's only a few pages, so you can look through that. I would also invite you to read through the very beginning here, where we have the preface that Luther wrote. That might allow you to gain some insight. And also, again, the commandments. They're very short. So, if you want to read up to page 46, that'd be great. It's really, if you put everything onto bigger pages, it would only be maybe 10 pages or so to read, but I would invite you to read those, and we will be back here again next week.